We are starting promptly at 12 because we know we have a large audience participating by webinar, possibly larger than usual because of the inclement weather we're having in Washington. For those attending on the webinar, we can't hear you, but we hope that you can hear us. If you have a problem hearing, you can't hear, please just send a note, send a message in the window at the upper right-hand portion of your screen. You can also send questions that way. We're going to be holding all the questions to the end. And when you send a question, if you would introduce yourself and say who your organization is in the little question box, that would be really helpful. Nothing about us without us. This has been the mantra of the disability community and actually many other communities for several years. It was certainly the mantra of Susan Daniels, whom we lost last week. I know we are all feeling the sadness and the loss of losing a dear friend and such a strong disability advocate and colleague. This mantra means that individuals with disabilities should be included in every aspect of life, including survey research. So think about this next time you get one of those phone calls during the dinner hour with somebody wanting to know where you shop for groceries. That's survey research, but it certainly isn't the kind of survey research that we do here. Although researchers have encountered barriers to including people with disabilities in survey research, involvement in the research project is really vital because that is often what programs are based on, is that data from survey research. This form presents an overview of the issues and challenges researchers face in surveying individuals with disabilities, focusing on some successful models for interviewing that we have tested out in some of our other projects, and also on a study that we did to determine how this research should be conducted. We also have a wonderful guest who will make some comments about future research and program implementation. So our first speaker this morning will be Julita Miller-Waddell, a researcher at Mathematica, and she'll explain why it's important for people to include people with disabilities in survey research and some techniques for doing so. Our second will be Karen Cybulski, who's a senior survey researcher, and she'll describe some successful strategies that we used through the Youth Transition Demonstration Project, which you heard about at our last forum. And Deborah Wright, who's an associate director for survey research, will talk about a study she did using SSA's National Beneficiary Survey. And then finally, we're extremely pleased to have Jamie Kendall, who's the Associate Commissioner of the Developmental Disabilities Administration, today to provide comment and talk about the policy implications.
Thank you, Bonnie. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge and thank Jason Markisich, who couldn't be here today but worked very hard on this presentation. This presentation synthesizes findings and recommendations from a number of Mathematica projects that were geared, I'm sorry, I didn't change my slide, I'm so sorry, that were geared towards improving disability data collection and facilitating the inclusion of people with disabilities in surveys. As we know, survey data are critical to support the development and management of programs and policies for people with disabilities. However, the methods used to collect these data often exclude the very people whose input is most relevant, and thereby introduces bias into population estimates. Moreover, if we utilize data collection methods that exclude people with disabilities, we are hindering their rights to self-direction and self-expression. In today's presentation, I'll discuss some barriers to program participation for people with disabilities. I'll offer some practical suggestions for overcoming those barriers, and suggest some methodological issues that we need to address going forward. This slide shows many of the methodological considerations that impact survey participation for people with disabilities and highlight issues that survey researchers must think through. Are you not hearing me? I'm sorry. How's that? Is that better? I'm sorry. Okay, so this slide shows many of the methodological considerations that impact participation for people with disabilities and highlights issues that survey researchers must think through at each stage of the survey process. What's important to note on this slide is that people with disabilities might be excluded from survey based on the decisions that, at any of the stages in the survey, based on the decisions that researchers make. So the challenge for us is to identify solutions that will encourage maximum participation. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go over each of the considerations on this table today. Instead, I'm going to focus on 3 areas: sample frame, decisions, proxy selection methods, and interviewer training. Please move closer. I'm sorry. Okay. All right. The sample frame is the entry point to the data collection process. So any error or bias introduced at this stage has major considerations for survey quality. And typically what we find is that many surveys exclude people with disabilities in the sampling frame. So for example, with the exception of the American Community Survey since 2006, most federal surveys exclude people living in non-household settings. Yet for a large number of people with disabilities reside in non-household settings, including group quarters, compared to people without disabilities. Compounding this issue is the dynamic nature of tenure in housing. Whereas some people reside in non-household settings permanently, others move in and out depending on their disabling condition. Non-probability frames, including lists of people participating in certain programs and receiving services for targeted or regional surveys, may have coverage issues as well. For example, people with mental retardation and developmental disabilities are likely to be excluded from program participation lists because they're less likely to participate in those programs. Also, there is some question as to whether RDD sample frames underrepresent people with disabilities because some of them may have difficulties or limitations using the telephone. Some preliminary research suggests that this may not be the case, but more research is needed here. Another key inclusion challenge is related to the methods used to select proxy respondents. The general consensus is that self-response is preferred over proxy response. However, self-response might not always be practical due to cognitive and physical barriers on the part of some respondents and resource deficits on the part of the data collection organization. For example, a survey firm may not have the resources to use adaptive technologies, for example. So the use of proxies often does facilitate inclusion by capturing individuals who cannot respond for themselves. A big problem is that proxy methods used to determine if a proxy is needed may not be valid or reliable, some proxy methods, that is. Some methods might indicate that a respondent cannot respond for themselves when in fact they can, and different methods might produce different rates and patterns of proxy response. Okay, let's look at some more issues related to common proxy selection methods. Gatekeepers, caregivers, and interviewers sometimes use subjective and unstructured approaches to decide whether or not a proxy is needed. Problems with these approaches include that gatekeepers and interviewers sometimes assume that just because someone has a disability, they will not be able to respond for themselves. Interviewers who are not well trained in interviewing people with disabilities may misread cues during the interviewing process and might assume that someone, for example, who takes a long time to respond does not understand the question, will not be able to answer, when in fact they may just need more time to respond. If proxy decisions are left largely to interviewers, they may apply inconsistent standards. There are proxy selection methods that are more objective and structured in nature, including short formal assessments of mental capacity, such as the mini-mental state examination and the telephone interview for cognitive status. While these provide standardization, these were not developed for research purposes. Instead, they were developed more for things like assessment intake evaluations at medical facilities. Some of the questions in these assessments are also rudimentary, and some people find them insulting. They ask things such as, who is the President of the United States, which may cause people to refuse to participate in a survey. As we just saw in the last slide, interviewers play a big role in deciding whether or not a person with a disability will participate in the survey. especially if they are left in charge of the proxy decision. But interviewers also impact inclusion in other ways. If interviewers are not adequately trained with the issues faced by respondents, they might interpret initial resistance to participate in a survey as because some people may resist initially participating in a survey because they don't understand the research objectives or they distrust the research objectives. And they may not be able to overcome those issues if they're not well trained in interviewing people with disabilities. Moreover, people with disabilities might be excluded by interviewers who are not trained on how to overcome barriers such as speech and hearing impairments, which present communication challenges, stamina challenges such as mental and physical fatigue, and cognitive challenges such as emotional disturbances and difficulty processing questions and responses. So what can we do to overcome these barriers? Let's consider the coverage issues with sampling frames mentioned earlier. That is, the tendency of sampling frames to exclude non-household units where many people with disabilities reside, and issues of coverage with list frames and RDD frames. To address these issues, a first basic step is to document and disclose sampling methods, including clearly defining the residence type included and excluded from those samples. We should also consider whether a supplemental frame is needed. We should conduct research to review the sampling methods in the various federal surveys to further assess what is known about the inclusion of individuals living in group quarters. And in addition, we could conduct more research on whether or not random digit dial surveys underrepresent people with disabilities. As mentioned, there hasn't been much research in this area. Lastly, some researchers have expressed the need for guidelines on developing sampling frames to ensure that the broadest range of people with disabilities are included. To improve proxy selection methods, it would be helpful to know more about the effects of using assisted interviews. Assisted interviews differ from proxy interviews in that the person responds for themselves in the presence of someone who can provide assistance as needed. Assistants do not respond, so this is preferable to proxy interview. It should become a best practice for survey researchers to clearly document and disclose all of the proxy decisions, why a proxy is used, when a proxy is used, and the relationship of the proxy to the respondent. And more research is needed on proxy selection methods that are most likely to minimize bias. A goal would be to use this research to develop guidelines that would standardize proxy selection. As noted earlier, one of the key barriers to survey inclusion is that interviewers may not be sensitive to the issues faced by people with disabilities. To overcome these barriers, a basic strategy is to use people with disabilities as interviewers. Also, researchers should develop materials that sensitize the interviewer to issues faced by the respondent and provide instruction on how to develop rapport. They should train interviewers on the use of adaptive technologies, such as instant messaging to facilitate survey participation, and as previously mentioned, interviewer guidelines on proxy selection are needed. All of these strategies will help reduce the chance that people with disabilities are excluded from surveys. In addition, when we think about training interviewers, especially to ensure that people with disabilities are included, communication is essential. Here are some practical and very easy to implement solutions on how interviewers can be trained to overcome communication barriers. Interviewers should use a normal tone of voice. They should use controls and headsets to amplify sound. They should not pretend to understand responses they do not, but instead they should ask for clarification. And they should engage with respondents before beginning the interview to learn their speech patterns. Similarly, to overcome stamina challenges, interviewers should be trained to be aware of cues suggesting that a respondent is tired or fatigued. They should be willing to set callback appointments for a time that's more convenient for the respondent, for a time when they're more alert perhaps. And survey researchers should also consider including checkpoints during the design of questionnaires that ensure that all respondents are asked at appropriate intervals whether or not they need more time, they need to be called back, or they need a break. To overcome cognitive challenges, interviewers should be trained to use active listening skills, learn non-biased, directive probing techniques, and above all, remain patient. While these strategies seem straightforward, incorporating role plays into training to confirm that interviewers can truly implement these strategies is essential. Some final thoughts before I close. Making surveys more inclusive for people with disabilities is challenging but essential to high-quality research. To do this, we need to include people with disabilities in all phases of the research process, from developing the research objectives, providing feedback on questionnaire design and modes to be used, and assisting with data collection. This approach is called participatory action research. We should opt for assisted interviews over proxy interviews whenever feasible. We should use available resources to help guide research decisions. For example, Mathematica has published a resource guide that includes over 150 abstracts and references on interviewing people with disabilities. Again, it's important to make thoughtful and deliberate methodological decisions during each stage of the survey process, and to document and disclose the methods to ensure we know who is included and excluded from surveys. Lastly, we should be willing to conduct more research that would be used to develop guidelines for best practices in disability data collection. By implementing these strategies, we should be able to increase participation of people with disabilities in surveys. This will increase our confidence that the data used to make public policy decisions more accurately represents people with disabilities and therefore more accurately represents the full population. Okay. And there is some contact information, and thank you very much.
Okay, before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, Ann Simnecki, who is joining us today via the webinar. And what I'm going to talk about today is the importance of engaging youth for participation in programs. And this was one of the first demonstrations where we made every effort to talk with the youth with disabilities directly about what they did, what they wanted, and what they needed. And for this project, not only did we collect data about the evaluation, but we also provided technical assistance and guidance to the site. So it was more formative in nature. So when issues arose, we were able to make mid-course corrections that helped keep the programs in line with the logic model that drove the demonstration. And for more detailed information about the youth transition demonstration, please refer to the issue brief that's available on the front table outside. So next, a little background information about the youth transition demonstration. The youth transition demonstration is a 9-year rigorous evaluation that's sponsored by the Social Security Administration. Its goal is to evaluate promising strategies that help youth with disabilities to grow to be as economically self-sufficient as possible. By waiving certain disability program rules and offering services to youth who are either receiving benefits or at risk of receiving them, these projects are expected to encourage youth to work or continue their education. Currently, there are 6 projects across the country that are being evaluated using a rigorous experimental design, which is randomly assigning youth to either a treatment group, which receives the YTD services and waivers, or to a control group that does not. About 5,000 youth aged 14 to 25 are participating in the demonstration. And at the end of the study, we'll compare results for the treatment and controls to see what, if any, impacts the YTD programs made in the educational attainment, employment and earnings, and receipt of benefits for the youth. And this is an unusual project from a survey research perspective, because we not only collected survey data for the evaluation, but we also recruited youth into the demonstration. Mathematica recruited youth and conducted a baseline interview. If youth was under age 18 or had a legal guardian, we spoke with the parent first and then asked to speak to the youth directly. If the parent or legal guardian was pessimistic about the youth's ability to participate in the interview, then an assisted interview was suggested. Following the interview, a consent form was mailed via priority mail to the youth and their family, and once written consent was received, random assignment was conducted. 65% of the youth who completed the baseline interview returned the consent form. And on average, it took 1 month to get the consent forms back. But for about 10% of the youth, it took 3 months or longer for us to get the written consent. And Mathematica made telephone reminder calls, remailed consent forms, conducted in-person follow-up to obtain the consent. So we made a lot of effort to get the youth the written consent from them. And families who were slow to consent tended to be highly mobile and have spotty telephone coverage. Often it's the pay-as-you-go cellular telephone, which is turned on and off on a regular basis. An example of this mobility was one family whose telephone service was interrupted after we conducted the baseline interview. So we went to the house to collect the written consent form. And when we arrived there, the family was packing. They were actually in the middle of moving yet to another new residence. We were able to get the consent at that point in time, as well as their new contact information. And the consent form is often not the highest priority for these families. It was to us, obviously, but not necessarily to them. And oftentimes we would walk into the house, and there was the priority mail envelope with a consent form, signed usually, on the dining room table after months of trying to get it returned. So in order to meet the enrollment goals of the demonstration, 400 youth had to be enrolled per site. And Mathematica worked with the projects to set monthly enrollment targets that were monitored on a weekly basis and discussed with the senior staff at each of the sites. And based on these reports, we identified that the sites were having difficulty meeting the monthly targets. And if the overall enrollment goals weren't met, this would be problematic for the evaluation, since we wouldn't have enough power to see differences between the treatment and the control group. So we met with the project staff. We reviewed case notes regarding efforts that the staff made to enroll youth into the programs. And based on these meetings and review of the notes, it became obvious that one area that programs were having difficulty was engaging youth. And this project is different for program staff because typically what happens is a client walks in the door. So they're highly motivated. They've already reached out to the program, and the program staff just enroll them into the program. Where here, sites had to actually reach out to the youth and enroll them into the program. So they weren't knocking on the door to be part of the program. So based on this, Mathematica developed technical assistance to help project staff with youth engagement. And one of the approaches that we discussed with them is a marketing tool known as the AIDA approach. And there are 4 steps to this approach: attention, interest, desire, and action. So the first step involves getting the youth's attention. So here we focused on ways to successfully make contact with the youth. And I'll talk more about this in just a minute. The second step involves piquing the youth's interest in the program. So here we focused on the advantages and benefits of the YTD program and worked with the sites to develop program-specific materials that highlighted key aspects of their program, as well as the waivers that SSA was providing to treatment youth in the demonstration. The third step involves sparking the desire in the youth to participate. And here we focused a lot on active listening. So once you're talking to the youth, what is it that the youth wants? Okay, is it a job? Is it further education? Is it one of the waivers that would be helpful? So actually listening and then being able to highlight how the YTD program can help the youth meet this goal. And then finally, Once you've gone through, you have their attention, their interest, and their desire. Next is action, taking action to actually enrolling the youth into the YTD demonstration and engaging in services. So at this point, you don't want them to slip away after you've made all this effort. You want to enroll them. As I mentioned, there were some project-specific materials that we worked with the sites on. There was a brochure which highlighted key aspects of the demonstration to get the consent, and then a flyer that the sites used to obtain participation in the program. And all of this technical assistance was very cooperative, so we worked very closely with the sites, and likewise they worked closely with us. There was a lot of give and take as we helped develop the materials and provide the technical assistance. So let's look a little bit at some of the ways that programs can help reach out and engage the youth. Enrollment and service delivery require very different approaches. So with service delivery, which programs are used to doing, it can be a more slow and systematic approach because you have the youth, they're already engaged, and you're delivering services. Enrollment needed to occur more quickly. We just completed the baseline interview. They signed the consent form. You wanted to talk to them while it was still salient. And part of what we found is that sometimes programs were waiting weeks, even up to a month, to contact the youth after they've already consented to participate. And this was just too long. At this point, they've already moved on and have forgotten about the YTD program, and so then you have to start from step one. So what we encourage is that the programs call the youth very soon after notification, ideally the same day. So don't wait weeks in doing it. And be flexible in when you do it. Something else that we heard a lot is that, well, this is our job. We work from 9 to 5. And if you think about the families that we're serving, 9 to 5 doesn't always work. The families, the youth are in school, parents are working, so a lot of the calls had to meet after 5 or on weekends. So we really encouraged them to be more flexible in when they were calling and reaching out. And sometimes, obviously, we encountered it, as did the sites, telephone service, just very spotty. So make that home visit. If the number is disconnected, then go to the home, talk to the youth there. Another really key thing is program staff would often, they'd get the youth, they'd place a call, get them answering machine, and they would leave a message immediately. And sort of what we encouraged is you wanted to maintain control of reaching out to the youth. So don't leave a message on the first call or even the second call. So vary when you call, try and get them first on the phone so you can actually speak with them before leaving the message. And then once you leave the message, you want the message to, again, stay control with you. So don't just say, well, call us back when it's a good time for you, okay? Because now you have to wait for when the youth's going to call. Instead, if I don't hear from you in a day or two, I will call back. So a lot of what we worked on was just really keeping control of engagement with the youth. And set firm appointments. So this was more back to the action piece. So once you have the interest and desire peaked in the youth, but it could be on the phone or you're setting in a time for them to come in, don't just say, well, come in next week, okay? It needs to be more like, okay, when's a good day to meet with you? Okay, Friday, that sounds good. What's a good time on Friday? Okay, 1 o'clock. So either it'll be I'll come to my office at 1 o'clock or I'll call you again at 1 o'clock. But again, you want to keep that conversation focused so that the program staff have control of it. And lastly, we encourage persistence without being overly aggressive. Something else that we found is that they would leave a message on the first call, and then it may be weeks until another call is made. And so here you want to continue to make appointments, call. If calls don't work, move to the house, move to a letter. So continue different approaches to engage the youth. And why is this important? Why was reaching out early important? Did it make a difference? Actually, we found that it did. On average, youth who enrolled were contacted 7 days earlier than non-enrollees. And as you might expect, non-enrollees require twice as much recruitment effort as enrollees did. So if you didn't get them right away, then you spent a lot of time trying to enroll them, so it's really good to reach out early. And it was important for the program staff to make the additional efforts to engage the difficult-to-reach youth, because if the only youth they served were the highly motivated and easy-to-reach youth, then we may not see differences between the two groups, because there are going to be highly motivated youth in the control group as well. And so you really needed to reach out and serve the harder to serve and the harder to reach youth, so that hopefully we'll see differences between the two groups. And following the first session of technical assistance, the enrollment rate increased by 13% in the first month, and an additional 4% in the second month. So we actually did see an improvement in the enrollment rate with the technical assistance. And all of the sites met their enrollment targets in the end. So not only is engagement useful at this first stage, but it was also important in service delivery. Part of what we discovered is that sometimes youth were given some initial services, but then they sort of stopped coming, and youth sort of just fell off the face of the earth. And so re-engagement with the youth was very necessary. So again, we worked with sites on that. Many of the techniques that we talked about earlier were also included. But here we also worked on some more personal approaches to try and reach out to the youth. So first, we started with a handwritten note. So rather than a form letter, actually handwrite something out and focus on what it is that the youth's goal was, and how, if the youth comes back to the program, you can help the youth meet that goal. Okay? So again, making it very focused on the youth and how the program can help serve the youth. After you send the note, call, follow up on it, and hopefully when you have the youth on the phone, talk about what are any upcoming programs that may be occurring at the site, or any activities that they know of that would entice the youth and encourage further participation. And as I mentioned, being flexible is really the key here. So just a couple of takeaway points. Engaging youth is really critical for success, and it's engaging youth at the various steps. So the initial recruitment into the project, enrollment, as well as service delivery. And the collaboration was really key. So it wasn't evaluators just telling sites what to do, but there was a lot of feedback that went back and forth with the evaluation staff and the program staff. And we were able to achieve high rates of enrollment for youth with disabilities. So overall, about 83% of the treatment youth were enrolled into the program. And as evaluators, it's important to manage by the numbers. So having these monthly enrollment targets allowed us to step in and make the mid-course correction and provide the needed technical assistance to the sites before it was too late. So, thank you.
Hello, I'm Deborah Wright, and the focus of my talk today is a little bit different than the two that we've heard, because I'm really going to be focusing on a very specific study that we did, comparing the quality of data collected by telephone versus an in-person interview in a study of persons with disabilities. So just let me start by giving you a brief introduction why we thought this was an important question to ask. As I think Julita referred to, we do often think that, in general, having an in-person component is necessary to adequately survey a population of people with disabilities. And this might be because it's not always possible to participate by telephone, or that folks may be hard to locate. We don't have phone numbers, and so we often need to go out into the field, find people in their homes that way. But, of course, this is an expensive way to interview people, and it may be, in fact, cost prohibitive for someone to fund a study that's entirely in-person interviews. So as a compromise, we often think, is there a way to mix modalities so that we can boost our response rates and be as inclusive as possible but control costs? So an example might be that we attempt to interview people by phone whenever possible, and if we can't accomplish that, then we move to an in-person follow-up for people who are difficult to locate or just simply can't complete by telephone. But what are the downsides to this approach? Well, while mixing modes can help us decrease non-response bias, meaning that bias that we might introduce if we don't include particular subgroups of individuals, we may introduce measurement error or mode effects. Now, we do know that telephone and in-person interviews are pretty similar because they both involve an interviewer. And they're not as different, for example, as, say, answers people might provide on a mail or a web survey and answers that they might give to somebody in person. But there are some key differences, and one is that in-person interviews generally allow interviewers to develop rapport more easily. They've got someone in front of them whose body language they can read, so they can pick up on cues that might indicate that someone's confused or struggling or needs to slow down. So in general, in-person interviewing makes it a little bit easier for the interviewer to match the pace and communication style of the person that they're trying to interview. Now, there is some literature on mode effects, and we know that certain response errors are more likely to occur by telephone than face-to-face. So, for example, the quantity of information that you get by phone tends to be a little bit less than you might get in person. Telephone respondents tend to be more likely to choose extreme categories, display more evidence of recency effects, or display what we call acquiescence, or the tendency to say yes or agree to the questions that are being asked. John Krosnick is a survey methodologist who suggested that one of the reasons for this is that telephone interviewing may simply be more difficult. So it puts a greater cognitive demand on the person that you're interviewing. So they have to, there's a certain time pressure that's associated with a phone interview that may not be as prevalent when you're interviewed in person. So you may feel like you need to keep up with the interviewer. The interviewer isn't as able to read those body language cues and slow down as necessary. He also has done some work looking at specifically people with low motivation or with limited cognitive ability, and has seen that this effect may be more pronounced in those two situations. So our particular research question here was, in a study of people with disabilities, would we see differences in the data quality we collected by phone versus face-to-face? I want to acknowledge that this particular experiment that I'll talk about today was funded by the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research, and this was an experiment that we embedded in one of our ongoing surveys, the National Beneficiary Survey, and specifically the most recent round that we conducted. This is a survey that's sponsored by the Social Security Administration, and it collects information from a nationally representative sample of SSI and SSDI beneficiaries, working age, on their health, well-being, service use, employment, and awareness of Ticket to Work, and that's because this is part of a larger evaluation of the Ticket to Work program. It involves a 45-minute survey, and it was designed to be dual mode. So, as I mentioned previously, we started trying to get everybody by telephone, and for those that we couldn't interview by telephone, we went ahead and tried to do a follow-up in person. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the experiment itself. This was designed as a randomized control design. So with the funding that we received from NIDER, we were able to select an additional 645 cases from the same sample frame that we selected the nationally representative beneficiary sample from for the main study. That then essentially was our experiment group, and that group we did not attempt any telephone interviewing with that group. We sort of held them in reserve and fielded them with our other in-person cases. So they did not receive any phone attempts. They simply received an in-person interview if possible. So our comparison group for the purposes of this study was anybody in the regular sample who was interviewed by telephone. So people who we attempted by phone, couldn't reach by phone, and we later sent to receive an in-person interview, were just considered non-respondents for the purposes of this study. So that yielded us a data set of a little over 1,500 cases, about 1,200 of which were completed by telephone and 345 which were completed in person. Because we did have a lower response rate for those experiment cases, those that we just did in person, we did take a look at our samples to see if there were differences in sort of characteristics of those who responded in each mode. We looked at things that we knew from our prior work on MBS were significant predictors of whether somebody was interviewed by phone or in person. Things like age, sex, education, ethnicity, race, type of condition, benefit status, and age of onset. And we found a few significant differences, but I do have a slide here just showing you comparing the characteristics of the samples on 3 variables that we did find some differences for, and you can see that we did have somewhat more Hispanics in our in-person condition. We had more concurrent beneficiaries, so people receiving both SSI and SSDI, and somewhat more people whose age of disability onset was less than 18 compared to 18 and older. So we use these variables and some of the others as control variables in our analyses. So let me tell you a little bit about what we were looking for here. These were the indicators of data quality that we focused on. So item non-response. That is the respondent giving an I don't know or a refused response to a question. Social desirability, and here we mean people being less willing to report or admit holding an undesirable opinion. Non-differentiation, which we define as the failure to distinguish between questions that are the same, using the same response scale in a series. So somebody might just give the same answer to questions using the same response scale. And then finally, acquiescence, which is the tendency to, as I mentioned, agree or provide a yes response, presumably without really spending time to think about it and verify that it's the right answer. Now, I will say that we looked specifically at items that we thought would represent these concepts. So this isn't in any way sort of randomly selecting items from the survey and seeing if there are differences in data quality, but really focusing in on items where we would expect to see differences. So, for example, for item non-response, we looked only at items where we had over 2% missing data anyway, which isn't a lot of items in this survey. You see here a general trend for more missing data when someone's interviewed by telephone, with the exception of the one item where we did see a significant effect, and that's household income. And I will say this isn't entirely inconsistent with research. This is typically a very sensitive item. We generally, if we're going to find a mode effect or a difference, we do see it for very sensitive items, and they're very unpredictable in terms of when you may see something like this. When is someone going to refuse to answer the question? Sometimes they're more likely to do it when when there's somebody in front of them that they're having to answer to, and sometimes they're more likely to do it when or less likely to do it when it's an anonymous situation. So it's not surprising that we've got a sort of a flip-flop effect here just because of the sensitivity of the item. We did look at a couple of other questions in series. So we had a series of questions about awareness of SSA programs and questions about health insurance. And we're here just looking for a count of number of items that were refused in that series. And again, a general trend towards more missingness in the telephone condition and a significant effect for the series of questions about health insurance. Moving on to social desirability. And again, here we're looking at questions where we think someone is going to be more likely to give or not want to admit holding socially undesirable opinion. So now, because the survey is conducted for SSA and it's about ticket to work and your goal is about working, we thought these might be questions people would be that people might consider sensitive. And in fact, we did see a trend when we're asking folks about their goals, about moving up or getting a new job, expecting to work for pay in the next year or working for pay in the next 5 years, a trend for people to report yes or to agree to those when they were interviewed by telephone. 2 of those were significant. But for the more typical items where you might think someone would be reluctant to admit drinking or drug use, we really see no effect. And the same for household income. Moving on to non-differentiation. Again, here where we're looking for people to be giving the same response to items that are using the same response scale, we really saw no effect between telephone and in-person. And these were questions about health-related activities, so how much their physical health limited their activities, the degree of difficulty they had doing activities, how much emotional problems limited their social activities, and how much emotional problems limited their daily activities. and those were all on the same 5-point scale. Okay, and finally, acquiescence, and again, this being, what we're looking for here is people saying yes, again, presumably without thinking about their answer first. We looked at some of the questions about awareness of SSA programs, and here we really focused on questions that were asked of everybody. Heard of expedited reinstatement, heard of benefit specialist, heard of ticket to work. And again, here a general trend towards people being more likely to say yes when interviewed by telephone, with a couple significant findings here. One for heard of expedited reinstatement and heard of ticket to work. So that's just a brief summary of our findings for those 4 constructs. What do I want to say in terms of conclusions here? Well, it does appear that data collection mode has a modest effect on data quality for this population. Compared to our telephone respondents, the in-person respondents tended to exhibit about the same level of item non-response, although we did see that trend towards more missing data in telephone. But about the same levels of non-differentiation. We did see evidence of fewer socially desirable responses and less acquiescence when people were interviewed in person as opposed to being interviewed on the telephone. So what does this mean? Well, in general, the findings are pretty consistent with other research on this topic in general population. So we don't really see evidence that this is exacerbated in this population or for this survey. Remember that we really picked items to look at that we thought we'd be the most likely to find effects for. So sensitive items, more complicated items, and indeed those were the items that we tend to see a difference if we see a difference. Now I will say that unfortunately we didn't have a large enough sample to really do any kind of subgroup analyses. So I can't tell you if people with cognitive or mental impairments were more likely to, that we would be more likely to see those effects in that subgroup than we would with people with physical disabilities. We just couldn't do that for this particular study. But as a general group, it didn't appear to me that this effect was greater than we would generally expect. And I guess the second point is that we need to balance measurement error with the need to include people with disabilities, obviously, and reduce non-response. So though you might introduce mode effects if you do this have this combined approach, you also, if you don't do that, may be losing important parts of your population. I think the other point here is that had we not had that in-person component, we would have had different estimates for some, just general estimates for some of these important key variables. And there are some surveys, such as the Behavioral Risk Factors Survey, that are administered telephone only. Now, telephone only can be a perfectly reasonable approach, even for a population of people with disabilities. And I think that Julita's touched on some of these things, but I would say that we did not conduct in-person interviews for the most part because we couldn't interview people by telephone. Surprisingly enough, the reason that we did in-person interviews for most people was we couldn't find them. So sort of to Karen's point, we were able to interview most people by phone using adaptive technologies. And then for some people, that's a preferred method as opposed to us coming out to their home and using a sign language interpreter. They'd rather do it by phone and use instant messaging or a relay operator. So it's not as though you can't do these kinds of surveys by phone. They can work really well. But we do need to think about the questions, and I think that's really what we need to think about in the design phase. Are there sensitive questions, complicated questions? And if that's true, then that's when we particularly want to think about the mode of interview. So I think that's my takeaway point here. And then finally, I have a caveat, of course, and that's that despite our best efforts to conduct this as an experiment and to control for sort of self-selection into one mode or the other, because, of course, the people who you interview by telephone are different than the people that you interview in person, we did have some characteristics made our samples different, and that's always going to be the case even in your best efforts and doing an experiment, but it is something that means we can't say definitively that these results are specifically due to the mode of interview only. And maybe some real differences here. So it may be that people who were interviewed by telephone were more likely to have heard of Ticket to Work, and that's why they're answering yes to that item. And it's not simply because they're more likely to answer yes because it's a telephone interview. So this is just a very difficult thing to parse out, and we just have to be mindful of it when we interpret the results. And
And then this slide, I've just got our contact information. And I will say there is also an issue brief out front that it relates to some other similar work that we've done on this topic on the National Beneficiary Survey. And now I will turn this over to our discussant. And can she use the keyboard if I take it?
Thank you. So, can you all hear me now? Okay, great. So, my name is Jamie Kendall. I'm the Deputy Commissioner at the Administration on Developmental Disabilities, and I'm very pleased to be here and would like to thank Mathematica for inviting me to be a discussant and for bringing this very important topic up. We know this is really important because having accurate information is really critical to creating meaningful results in our data collection efforts. And, of course, we know that evidence-based research today is just essential to design programs and also to sustain programs. So whether we're doing something targeted towards people with disabilities or designing a program that includes people with disabilities who you serve, it's a very important thing to think about. So I appreciated what was offered by our first presenter in terms of methodological considerations, because these are really fundamental when we're designing the work that we do. I hope that we can move further our national data sets in terms of the non-household settings for exclusion. I know that the ACS does include non-household settings, but in 2009, just to give you a little more information on that, 42 states operated over 2,600 residential settings. So we are excluding quite a few folks when we leave them out. I applaud what was talked about in terms of participatory action research, and that self-response is always desirable, and I think that's good that we're starting at that fundamental piece, frankly, in terms of our population. And I know we need to start having more dialogue and thinking through how we can do that better. So in that line, determining whether a proxy is appropriate, I think we really need to improve our thinking around getting to a place where there's less of a judgment call and more of an assessment put in place, and an assessment put in place specifically for research purposes, not pulled from another environment. So, of course, we know the unintended consequences of a cognitive screener is that we leave out people who we really need to hear from. So touching upon that, we know that interview training is really critical. And in that regard, there needs to be a general competency training on disability awareness, I think, for those going out in the community and interviewing people with disabilities. And in terms of just the fundamental floor on that, we should be coming from a place of positive, can-do, not negative, judgmental, perhaps this person cannot communicate well. I think we need to start with how do I get them to communicate in a way effectively with me. So I appreciated the discussion around thinking through not just communication but stamina in that regard and coming up with a way that works effectively to get the results you would like to have. You did touch upon the Mathematica resource guide. I think that's very helpful. I'd like to see it get disseminated and used, because having it is a good start, and then continuing the efforts so people actually know it's there and can draw upon it. So when we think about proxy selection, when this does actually occur, again, we all agree that assisted interviews should be used whenever possible, and that self-response is always best. I heard a discussion around that not always being practical, and I'd like to push you all on that a little bit to think about how you might make it practical in ways that perhaps are not expensive, can be cost-effective, and not only for the researchers but the funders and developers who are creating studies. How do we allow for a real direct resource for that regard and technical guidance in that regard? And I think in that light, standards and definitions can help determine whether a proxy is necessary. In terms of the presentation on whether telephone or face-to-face interviewing was something that there was a mode effect for people with disabilities, I appreciated the information that was provided. I think it would be helpful to do a subgroup analysis in the future and see if there is a difference based by disability type. I'd also like to understand how this data might differ differently for nationally representative sample. You did say that, by and large, this is consistent with findings. In terms of youth transition, I have to confess that I was actually the co-tar for this project for quite some time, so I know a little bit more about this one. And I appreciated Karen's presentation and how Mathematica and Social Security and the state partners really did put together a thoughtful approach which tried to include individuals with disabilities throughout the entire thinking process, both for enrollment, engagement, and the evaluation piece. So issues of trust at the very beginning, as Karen discussed, were something that needed to be thought through, and the disability awareness piece for the folks that are going out into the field was something we talked a lot about. Outreach and invitation materials and making them culturally competent for people with disabilities and accessible were emphasized, and it was very important to think through those pieces along a number of different fronts. We did find, I think, possibly some issues around gatekeepers with the parents, and that goes to the average number of contacts in order to get a consent that Karen was speaking about. So there's obviously a budget implications because we didn't anticipate having that many contacts in order to actually get these consent forms in. I think that the ADA approach that Karen discussed, getting youth attention, their interest, their desire, and action is something that, whether you're a youth with a disability or a youth, is probably something that is very relevant. So I thought it would be very interesting to look at other studies that looked at youth of the same age group and how their consent process went, and if it was similar or different, and how much of a gatekeeper issue was perhaps because of disability or perhaps because they were youth. So just to finish up, I think it's really important that we continue to think about disability along the entire process of designing and implementing research, and that's whether it's research targeted to individuals with disabilities or research in general where disabilities are part of the broader population. And that inclusion and communication, if not done correctly, will introduce bias, and that will undermine the whole intent of the study. So coming from a place of including people and the notion that they can communicate and individual needs may need to be thought through a bit will ultimately get us all better data and produce better programs. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm David Stitt. I'm the director of the Study of Policy. Bonnie has to leave, so I'm going to conduct the Q&A, and I'd like these speakers to come up here. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, violating the rules. All right, so I'm David Stapleton, still, and I'm going to conduct the Q&A because Bonnie has to leave. So I'm going to have the three speakers come up here, and we'll stand over here with Jamie, and we'll pass this mic around. For people in the room who have questions, Allison has a hand mic, so please put your hand up, and she'll bring the mic to you. And we already have hands up, so ready to go here. And please say who you are, and also what organization you're associated with.
Hi, I'm Jen Rigger with Social Security. I kind of have two questions, but I'm going to start with a YTD one. I know you guys did random assignment, and I'm curious about during the enrollment phase how you dealt with, you might be in the treatment group, but you might not. You know, can you talk a little bit about that process and kind of the impact it had on your enrollment?
Well, for the random assignment process, we started at the very beginning discussing random assignments. So the advanced letter discussed the benefits of the YTD program and that by participating in the interview, you would have a chance to receive these additional benefits. And a lot of the focus was really just on that, by participating, you would get and you were selected to receive the additional benefits, or you wouldn't be. So it wasn't really a treatment and control discussion with youth and their families, but you would have a chance to receive these additional benefits.
Did you get any kind of pushback around, what do you mean I won't get, what do you mean my kid might not be part of it?
We actually had more pushback from sites, I would say, than the families themselves. So just program staff who were uncomfortable that some youth were not receiving the benefits because obviously they wanted everyone to receive them. And so keeping the whole random assignment piece, sort of having the sites understand the importance of it and just the need for a very rigorous design to evaluate the program. So again, that was an area of technical assistance. We worked very closely with the sites, but the families didn't actually, it wasn't the same issue with random assignment.
Hi, my name is Teresa Souza, and I'm from HUD. And at HUD, we have the American Housing Survey that we used in the past to assess worst housing needs. And for a long time, we used receipt of SSI and SDI as a proxy for disability. And in 2009, for the first time, we had a direct questions on disabilities, the same ones that ACS has. And then for the first time, we were able to compare how the proxy compared with the direct reporting. And we found that there were a lot of people that reported receiving SSI or disability supplement, but they were not reporting themselves as having disability in the 6 questions. So I was wondering, I understand that you mentioned that you were not able to separate the types of disability, but were you able with your design to understand if there is a subgroup that directly reports disability and what were the differences in terms of telephone interviewing and face-to-face for that group in comparison with the ones that might receive this supplemental income but might not report themselves as having disabilities? Thank you.
We didn't actually look at that within this experiment, but it would be an interesting question. We do ask people, we don't ask people if they're receiving benefits, because the assumption is that they are, or they wouldn't be in our sample. But we do ask people if they have a disabling condition. We don't phrase it that way. It's really about, do you have a condition that limits your daily activities? And we could look at that, and that would be an interesting thing to look at. Were there differences in responses to that item by telephone or face-to-face? But I do know just from other work we've done analyzing some of the NBS data that, because we do have this administrative data as well, people do not always report that they have a limiting condition, even though they have an impairment because they're collecting SSI or SSDI. They have an impairment as far as SSA's purposes go. So that's been interesting, and it's not always the same. So often we think people, for example, may not report they have any limitations if they're seeing impaired because they've got adaptive technologies, and they don't really see that it limits their ability to work or do other things anymore. So it is an interesting question. We didn't look at it for this particular study, but it does make sense to do.
Other questions? Angel? Allison? Right up here, Al. Angel.
Hi, Hi, my name's Angel. I'm a PhD student in the University of Maryland and a former Mathematica summer fellow. So my question is, I know you all looked at people with multiple types of disabilities, and I was wondering, were there any specific, like, adaptive technologies that you use for the instruments that you use? So, because every disability has different implications for how you interview someone and everything. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you accommodated people with different types of disabilities.
So typically at Mathematica, when we design a survey for a population of people with disabilities, we make the assumption that there'll be a wide range of disabling conditions and that we aren't able to design for every single condition. And as Halida mentioned, what we do is we try to address the three major challenges to the data collection process. So cognitive barriers, stamina, and fatigue. And work all of those into the collection process. At the cognitive level, we try and keep the reading level to about 6th grade. To address some of the acquiescence bias issues, we try not to have strings of yes-no responses, or if there is one, we follow up with a question that gets more information about the question. We use a lot of adaptive technologies such as instant messaging, relay operators. For a phone interview, line is not really an issue since we're calling. And Debbie?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the only other thing I would say is we don't make any assumptions up front about what accommodation somebody might need. So it's really built into our instruments that interviewers are prompted to ask that information or ask what is it that we can do to make this possible for you. Not in that exact way, but there's no assumption up front that somebody's not going to be able to do it. We just have things in place. So interviewers, really resources that interviewers can turn to and use.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. That's fine.
I think this goes to Jamie. I'm not sure. You had mentioned some ways, some strategies that we should be thinking about in terms of proxy decision making. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things you might put on that list?
Sure. I mean, I think it's really, the heart of it is coming up with some standards and not putting things into the language on determining whether a proxy is needed is does a person have a serious disability? What does that mean? So that makes the judgment call subjective on the part of the interviewer. So it's creating some clear, concise questions and an assessment tool around communication, around fatigue, around stamina.
Just on that topic, too, I would add that we have done some research in this area. For example, the National Beneficiary Survey, we did use a cognitive screener that was specifically designed for that survey. We didn't do the design work on that. We did a little bit of tweaking after a pretest, but Karen's been involved in some of that. I've been involved in some of that, trying different ways to get at what Jamie's talked about. That is, not using one of these tools that's not designed for a research purpose, but trying to develop something that will work in this setting.
Okay, let's take one from the people out there in the ether.
This is a question from Crystal Blyler with the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And the question is, have you had experience using email, web-based, or text surveys? If so, how do you find these technologies affect response rate, participant selection, and response quality?
I'll just say that I know I worked a while ago on the Accelerated Benefits Demonstration Survey, and for that survey we tried to anticipate and to have in place accommodations for that, and we did a lot of programming. We spent quite a bit of resources anticipating that we would use like an instant messaging, and we absolutely did not have to use it. So I think that, so I can't really say how it worked, because we didn't end up using it.
Other questions? You have more on the... Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yes.
Hi. Again, back to the face-to-face and telephone. Do you know what research tells about the difference between mail survey and telephone and face-to-face? And I'm thinking about ACS and AHS because of that. ACS, I think, starts with mail, then goes to telephone, and then goes. So is there a difference for this population?
I don't know of any research that's looked at that with this population specifically. There's a lot of general population kinds of surveys or experiments done with college students. But generally speaking, you'd see the largest differences for example, comparing mail to face-to-face or even mail and telephone, simply because you don't have an interviewer in the mail mode, and that makes a big difference, particularly for some of the sensitive items. So people may be more willing, for example, to report something on a mail survey or paper form than they would be in front of an interviewer or on the phone. So, yeah, there definitely is some evidence that there are differences there as well, but not specifically that I know of for this population.
I mean, I think I can just say that we typically stay away from sort of web and mail for studies that are specifically of people with disabilities, just because you then add in the cognitive component, which is about a third of the population for most of our studies. And so in order to keep comparability and not have dramatic mode effects, we stay to the modes that are interviewer assisted in one way or the other.
Hi, I'm Scott Brown, now with WestApp. We've talked for many years about involving people with disabilities at the front end of the process, the design phase. And at least until I left the government, that pretty much involved having an advisory board with some people with disabilities, or maybe a principal investigator or somebody on the project. Can you talk a little bit about maybe your suggestions as to how you make this a little more systematic to have the involvement of people with disabilities at the front stages of the process in a meaningful way? And I recognize that the heterogeneity of the population forms a lot of critical issues there.
I can speak to the YTD demonstration, as well as some other general surveys that Mathematica has done. For YTD, yes, we definitely had an advisory board which had people with disabilities as part of that, but we also, in the design phase, included some of the youth and their parents in the design of actually each of the surveys. So we do a baseline survey, we do a 12-month follow-up survey, and then a 36-month follow-up survey. And we also have interviewers who also have a disabling condition, who either conduct some of the interviews. We also use as sort of pretest respondents, so we ask them to do an initial pass of the interview with us to make sure it's accessible. And we try and get a range of disabling conditions. Obviously, we also have principal investigators that also have a disabling condition and also can provide feedback.
Jamie, I don't know if you can answer this question, but it might be interesting to, if you can, to talk about other ways that youth or their families were involved in designing the demonstration services themselves as opposed to the survey.
No, I think that's a good question, and I was going to touch upon that with the focus groups that were part of the design work that went in before the actual implementation of the program. So there was quite a bit of focus group work where the youth were directly asked, as their families were directly asked, what would you see as useful from Social Security and its partners in terms of helping you to transition from school to work. So it's not rocket science. It's directly engaging and asking the people that are the beneficiaries of the program.
Hi, I'm Ann Stahl from the Social Security Administration. You mentioned the follow-up surveys. Do you have any plans of surveying these youth when they become young adults or even later on to ask about? I was at a hearing this morning where they gave several indicators about school dropout, the proportion that drop out of school, the proportion that have some kind of contact with the justice system, things like that. To compare your control groups to your participants later on in life to see if these indicators are different for the two groups?
As of right now, the furthest out we go is 36 months. Obviously, from an evaluation perspective, it's very important, as you point out, to follow these youth further out, so 5 years out, 10 years out, and possibly even 20 years out from that currently is not in the evaluation plan, although hopefully it will be. I know Social Security is also planning to continue looking at wages and earnings through administrative data over time for both groups. So there is that follow-up in place already.
I mean, it's such a rich data set that you're collecting now. You could really use that with other, like justice statistics and a lot of things to follow and see how much you're saving society in cost, actually. If you
Yes, I fully agree, as I believe do the researchers on the project. We're currently just finishing the 36-month survey for our initial site, so we're not quite at that point, but hopefully.
Okay, back over to the webinar participants.
Right, this is regarding the telephone and face-to-face interviews. Why do you think social desirability was lower in the face-to-face interviews? And would you have expected it to be the other way around because of the increased anonymity on the phone?
Who asked the question?
Ishbel, I can't say the full last name now.
Okay, all right. Did you get the question?
I think that the results were generally in the expected direction for those particular items. Typically, we would expect that people would, well, I guess I can see the argument for the other way around, but, one of the concerns here, of course, with these particular items is that there are also items that you could think people are just answering yes to. So it's a little bit difficult to parse out, is the effect social desirability, or is it acquiescence? So that may be part of what we're seeing here as well. But we certainly did see a general trend towards more of that by telephone than we did in person. So it's either that the items are, it may not be that those particular items people need anonymity for to answer, or that it's really more of this acquiescence effect.
More in the room? Angel.
Hi, it's Angel again. So, Ms. Kendall suggested that national sampling frame should be more inclusive for people with disabilities, and also that we need to ensure cultural competency for interviewers. And so I was just wondering if you all had a suggestion for, how we can implement that, like, more at a national level for things like, I guess, like the census, or even, grants for NIH and things like that. So, for example, in some calls for research, it's now expected to include that women are included and that people of color are included. And so would you suggest that people with disabilities, like that might become more of a policy for initiative to include people with disabilities and more studies on those levels?
Okay, thanks, Angel. I think that really it starts with the federal funder and the way the federal funder writes the technical requirements in a way that meets the needs to ensure that there is cultural competency and the disability aspect as long, in addition to across the board cultural competency. We don't drop disability out of that equation. So it starts with the federal funder and what requirements we put in to the contracts that go forth and prosper. And so it does mean putting those requirements in from the beginning.
Just following up on that, in my understanding, there are no specific OMB guidelines about how to include people with disabilities in surveys or interview them or anything like that. And, do you know if there are similar sorts of guidelines in other countries, or anybody from NIDR, perhaps? Oh, okay. You have another one, Claire?
This question comes from Noelle Kurth, Senior Health and Disability Researcher at the University of Kansas. The question is, can you share ways of increasing participation for people with intellectual disability in any survey or interview format?
Okay, so what we've done at Mathematica in some studies is we've, we try first for self-response. But if we can't do that when we go with assisted interviews. And if assisted interviews don't work, then we go with a proxy interview. In addition, though, depending on the nature of the disability, or we may need to break up the interview into several sessions. We just try to accommodate if somebody has a short attention span, for example. We may need to do it over time. Instead of 30 minutes, we may need to do 3 hours. We'll just have to do what we need to do to accommodate that person and get that completed interview. What else have we done?
So I think for Mathematica, it all starts at the design phase, and that a lot of our thought going into it is that everyone can respond. And so the design of our surveys, as I mentioned earlier, we really try and keep it at a 6th grade reading level, or even lower when possible, so that individuals with cognitive disabling conditions are able to participate. And as Halida said, we really encourage assisted interviews for people who can't, so that questions that they're able to understand they can answer entirely on their own, and for questions where there may be more difficulty, someone who is there with them can help them understand the question and answer the question.
And again, it may be that for those individuals, a face-to-face interview works better. And so that's another reason to ask, or for someone to request somebody to come to their home instead of doing it by telephone.
Any other burning questions? We're about out of time. Yes. Okay. So I want to thank you all for coming, and also invite you to come to our next forum, which is on January the 20th. We're having fewer forums this year because we're moving in November to our new office space, which is just north of Union Station. The address is given there, and we saw a picture a minute ago of the new office. The forum is, and actually you can pick up a flyer for the forum as you leave, and there's also a map to show you where the new place is. And I know for some of you it's not going to be as convenient as this location is, but we got too big, and they didn't want to give us more space, so we have to move. But it's a great facility, and I think you'll enjoy being there. We expect to enjoy being there. The topic for this one is the transition to 21st century disability policy in an era of fiscal austerity, a roadmap. And the speakers are David Mann, who's in our New Jersey office, and myself, and Bonnie O'Day, who was here earlier today. And Kelly Buckland will be a commenter. He's the executive director of the National Council on Independent Living. And we're going to talk about a paper that David Mann and I wrote very recently concerning how you can move forward with improving disability in the context of a world where everybody wants to cut the federal budget. So I hope you'll find it interesting, and I hope to see lots of you there. So thank you very much for coming, and thank all the speakers, please.
Thank you for joining today's WebEx session. You may now disconnect.